would require Tubman's most ingenious plan to date.
She chose to disguise President Lincoln in blackface and travel with him along one of her many secret slave routes. When Lincoln scoffed at the plan, Tubman, never one to mince words, reminded him of the huge bounty on his head. She said simply, "We're both niggas now, Mr. President."
Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland, 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 oh, Dixieland. Praise God, rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human.
All right, y'all. Thank you for tuning in to Dixieland and the Proletariat. We're going to talk about Southern working class history and current events through a leftist perspective. Make sure to like us on social media at Dixieland and the Proletariat or Dixie Prol. And if you want to give your wages to a bunch of rednecks, then subscribe to our Patreon page at patreon.com/DixieProl. We got a lot of cool stuff to give you, including CDs, stickers, a cookbook, Discord server, Twitch stream, and exclusive episodes. We also have a Spotify playlist with some great artists you also check out. This podcast is brought to you by Camel Silver's Vaping, Living at Home, Pushing Peoples in the Swamp, Robert E. Lee having sexual relations with his horse, and everything bad about the Confederacy. Shout out to our new Patreon subscribers this month. Our monthly Patreon surplus goes to groups that are run by and or help marginalized people directly. As always, I'm Nelson, today with...
States' rights.
I'm Stonewall Jackson.
I'm not playing their game. Kai is still here, and I'm sick, in case you couldn't tell.
And our guest this evening is...
I'm Chris Dier. I'm an author and history teacher from New Orleans. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Chris. The intros, yeah, it's like a running gag that they don't know.
I was like, did I come to the wrong podcast?
No, you're good. You're good.
No,
I don't know when that started. It was one of those things. I think Tommy was the first one to do it, and it just morphed into like a thing. But how's everybody doing? I know Kaiser, we hope you feel better. You know, the allergies are fucking horrible. It's not.
Yeah, it's currently Kai's ASMR voice. So if anybody likes the raspy, you can pay me my raise. Like, I'm gonna go with $20 an hour for now, but it's only gonna last for like 2 more days.
You should just set up a hotline. Just
those old 1-900 numbers.
Yeah. Dial in now.
I'm not going to try to interact very much because obviously I sound pretty gross, but I wanted to be here anyway. So,
awesome.
Hi everybody.
Hell yeah. But yeah. So Tommy, Ty, y'all doing good?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. How about you, Tyler?
Tyler, doing well?
I'm good. I mean, it's Easter.
Yeah, it's true.
Oh, it is Easter.
What y'all do for Easter?
Fucking spent way too much money on building fucking Easter baskets for kids.
Oh yeah.
Just for them to eat all that fucking candy in like one day and then just be terrible all day. Like,
did you hide the Easter eggs?
I let my sisters do it, and they literally went out in the front yard and just threw eggs. All the eggs were found in like 5 minutes. I was like, well, there's that.
Chris, did you have a good Easter? This is a fellow Italian American. We finally got the Italians represented here on the podcast. This is nice. This is a thing.
Hell yeah.
Kai, don't roll your eyes at me. Don't roll your eyes, Kai. Okay, I saw
Not
that.
only did I roll them, I crossed them.
Oh, God,
like we needed more Italians on here.
Hey, yo, wait.
Too much gabagool in there.
In fact, I was just watching one of your TikToks, and before I could swipe off of it, I heard gabagool before I could leave.
Oh, man. Chris, you have a good Easter?
Oh, yeah. I had a great Easter. A lot of casseroles, and in Louisiana, we eat crawfish, too, because it's crawfish season. So that was delicious. That was good stuff.
Hell yeah. But let's get right into it then. So basically, this is an episode that, as Tyler reminded me, was supposed to be done very, very early on. We talked about it as being like the 3rd episode. Now it's like the 41st episode. And kind of wanted to maybe do it in 3 parts, but we're just going to kind of condense it into one because like battlefield history is boring, but this part of the Civil War, I think, definitely needs to be taught. It is the myth of the lost cause, and basically what the lost cause is and why people believe it, and how it's perpetuated throughout U.S. history. So I'm gonna let Chris take it, and I got some notes at the end, but hopefully we'll have a discussion about this and talk about why people believe this shit.
Yeah, sure. This is awesome because this is, what I teach this kind of history. So to be able to talk about it on the podcast seems pretty cool. So yeah, essentially the lost cause is pseudo history at best. It's white supremacist history. It perpetuates many myths about the Civil War, but there are three main myths, and I'm going to discuss those in no particular order. But the first component is that the cause of the Confederacy during the Civil War was a just and heroic one. And with that, you have this idea that the antebellum South was upheld by this type of chivalry and these Christian principles. The second component views the war as a struggle to protect states' rights, especially the right to secede against, quote, northern aggression, while denying the central role of slavery and white supremacy as the root causes of the war. And this is the most prominent myth you probably see today. There's all sorts of, just on TikTok videos that I make, this is the one that popped up so often that I decided to make videos addressing it. They might mention things like taxation, culture, economic differences, and those reasons, while ignoring the intricate role of slavery and white supremacy in those factors anyway. And the last component, and I think arguably the most evil and probably has the most implications for today, they perpetuated this idea that slavery was a benevolent institution because the enslaved were fed, housed, and treated well, and that slavery brought great economic progress to the country. Obviously, these myths existed well before the emergence of lost cause ideology, but if you're going to claim that the South was noble and just, then they picked up these myths and made it kind of part of lost cause ideology or mythology. So actually probably should be called mythology because there's nothing accurate about any of these beliefs. And they used all sorts of rationales to make these claims, like the idea that slavers and or former enslavers would try to make the case that the enslaved had a better life than the white working class working in factories. So they would push a lot of these narratives to, make the North look bad and Southern lifestyle look like that's the way things should be. Now, I can keep talking about how the waves of lost cause ideology and how it was pushed, but feel free to chime in whenever if you want to chime in, or I can keep going about that.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. If you want to break down each one, we can go from there. And then I read Edward Bonekemper III's book, and he actually narrowed down 7 causes, 7 parts of the myth of the lost cause. The 3 that you talked about are definitely the main 3. But there's I guess subsections that you would call that he added to that. So I can chime in here and there, and I know my co-host is definitely going to have questions. But yeah, if you want to go ahead and break down those 3 and talk about the history and why we believe this shit. My dad is a diehard lost cause believer, and I've heard this shit my entire life, and so I've had the opportunity to look at this and break it down. But definitely for go right at it, and we'll just chime in when we can.
Yeah. So there were many waves that was pushed that had, I mean, as you said, there were many different proponents of this type of ideology. I think you mentioned 7. One in regards to Reconstruction era. It was very, it was an intricate web, but it was 3 that stood out. And there was these waves of lost cause ideology through our country that was pushed. And the first wave happened right after the Civil War. An historian named Edward Pollard, he was from Virginia. He was a self-proclaimed historian, but by any definition of the word, he was more so a fiction writer. But he wrote a book in 1866 titled The Lost Cause, A New Southern History of the War of the Confederates. And then he followed that in 1868 with The Lost Cause Regained. And he specifically promoted myths regarding slavery and even claimed that slavery elevated Black people. So he perpetuated a lot of these myths that people cling to. But you also had Confederate generals, you had Southern sympathizers, Confederate sympathizers. They were bombarding newspapers, they were bombarding any type of media that they could possibly get their hands on at the time to perpetuate these myths. And you also had in 1881, Jefferson Davis published his memoir in defense of the Confederacy and lambasted the Union as, quote, aggressors. And during the same time, they were also condemning the Reconstruction era, or the movements during Reconstruction for people to gain civil rights. And then a second wave of the lost cause happened when the Confederates, the actual veterans, started to die out. And this was right before World War I started, a little before Woodrow Wilson and his inauguration, but it went on into his inauguration. And that was a push to preserve their memories. And this is where the infamous Daughters of the Confederacy really stepped up their racist game to fund the building of these monuments and memorials all across the country, not just in the South, but they even unveiled a Confederate memorial in Arlington National Cemetery. And that actually was, Woodrow Wilson was actually at that unveiling and spoke there. So this wasn't just, relegated to the South. And the UDC, they I don't even know where to begin, but they were made up of women who came from elite antebellum families, and they essentially wanted to deify the Confederacy. And the last push of the lost cause narrative happened during the Civil Rights Movement. And this is where the Confederate battle flag really gained prominence. A lot of people associate it with the Civil War, and it was definitely used during the Civil War as a battle flag, but it didn't become this type of symbol that we see today until that civil rights era, the backlash against the civil rights era, because these people, these racists that were trying to fight against integration, were actually, they felt like they were in a moral battle that they were fighting against and liken themselves to the Confederacy. So to sum up, essentially the lost cause, three main factors and three main pushes. Obviously, there's more factors and way more to it, and the implications are definitely still seen today. I mean, I could think of myself growing up in a working class suburb of New Orleans. There was a rebel park here, and the team logo was a Confederate flag. There was a school named after PGT Beauregard because he was from the area. So it was prominent. And also in where I'm from, in New Orleans and the surrounding areas, it was a Union territory most of the time. It was taken over by the Union in 1862 with not much resistance. So that's just how invasive this lost cause ideology is. And I think what's so dangerous are the implications today that I'm sure we're going to get into, with people actually believe in this, and then policy comes from it, and movements come from it, and actions come from it that create and cause actual material harm.
So we want to talk about the first point that was touched on, the whole idea that the South, that slavery somehow benefited Black people and benefited the nation as a whole. It's just absolute bullshit. One of the big things in the myth that comes up is that slavery was a dying institution by 1860, which is absolutely not true. What we see happening is that slaves are being rented to the newly industrialized Virginia area. And there's a whole plan in place of renting slaves to work in factories. And so the institution of slavery was going to continue. And then what Bonekemper actually talks about in his book, which I thought was absolutely insane, was that the price of slaves goes up all the way until 1860. But also what you see is that with that increase comes slaves in Mississippi were actually worth more than all the cotton that were being picked. So the amount of money that was in slavery as an institution in Mississippi was worth more than all the cotton that was produced in Mississippi. And this institution was not dying. And what Bonekemper definitely goes into a lot is that slavery was not this, happy-go-lucky thing. It was a disgusting, horrible institution, and how there were codes in place that how masters were supposed to treat their slaves, but there was really a two-tier justice system in that white people were tried for this code of laws, and then slaves and the slaves were doled out horrible, horrible punishment compared to anything that white people went through. He goes to specific examples of just the horrors of slaves that were caught trying to run away, like held in cages until they were eaten by bugs and birds. It was just absolutely disgusting.
No,
this-
yeah, and
yeah.
the height of slavery was 1860 in the United States. That was the height of
Mhm.
slavery. Over 4 million people locked in bondage. So the idea that it was going away or somehow that it was, is just untrue. It was growing, it was expanding, and the slave states wanted to expand because it was a booming market for them. So I mean, I think that's also probably part of lost cause myths. The idea, because I've had people, like students, believe things like, oh, the cotton gin, that probably mechanized industry, so that led to less slavery. But in fact, the opposite happened: is that it would ignite, it would intensify slavery because that meant more profits, and people can gain more profits to buy more people. So, and yeah, you're right. It was an absolute brutal system. I always tell my students, like, no matter what I say or what I give you to read or how we try to understand this and what happened, I will never be able to give it full justice because of its absolute intense brutality. And it's unfathomable to try to wrap your head around how brutal of a system it was.
And going back to where like the first wave and when this starts, you have the Southern Historical Society really pushes this lost cause narrative. And Bonekemper quotes ex-officers of the Confederacy. It says that, like, oh, the North is gonna, the whole thing is that the victors write history, right? So, but in this case, the losers wrote the history, and the Confederate officers were so horrified that they could that the North was going to paint them as horrible people. So they perpetuated this myth, like definitely through Reconstruction, and the two. So like General Jubal Early and William Pendleton of the Confederacy, both high-ranking generals in the Confederacy, really pushed what Bonekemper says is like this folk epic of like what the Confederacy was about. And it was to, uphold like white Christian values, and white womanhood was a big thing. And that they were fighting for honor and bravery in like the South. And they want to pretend that like antebellum South was like this wonderful, great, happy-go-lucky place when, like we just said, it wasn't at all. It was absolutely disgusting. And they really put the blame on a lot of things on people that don't really deserve blame. For example, one thing that I like to rant about was how fucking horrible Robert E. Lee was. And because Robert E. Lee, as a component in the myth of the lost cause, is like held up to be this like great general. And Bonekemper in 2 books just like slaughters this myth and says that Lee gave big grandiose orders and that no one really could understand what he was saying. The only person who could interpret them was Stonewall Jackson. And that's why when Jackson dies in the middle of the Civil War, everything just goes downhill because no one could interpret his orders. He's like gives very vague, grand things. This really comes to head at Gettysburg, and why Lee's just horrible decision making cost them that battle. But then also, with that being said, they want to place the blame on Longstreet. And why they place the blame on General Longstreet, they lie and say that there's some order that Lee's supposed to say, you're supposed to attack at dawn, but it never happened. But they blame Longstreet because Longstreet actually challenged Lee and said, hey, your tactics in this battle are bad. We're going to lose. But why they really hate Longstreet is because after the war, he becomes a Republican. And he puts down a rebellion in Louisiana, a white Democrat trying to overthrow the Reconstruction government. He puts that down, and he ends up becoming an ambassador, I think, to the Ottoman Empire and present-day Turkey. And so they really just lambast his name and say that it's his fault. They place the blame solely on him when it really wasn't. And Lee, for an example, really only cared about the battle in like Virginia, and he really didn't care about the Western theater. And one of the things that Bonekemper brings up is that the Confederacy, like he has generals begging Lee for like more support. We need more supplies. We need more people. We need this. And Lee's just like, no, we're good. Or he like really just doesn't want to send it, but he just like sends it, but he's like really mad about it that he has to send troops. And so Grant and Sherman just take complete advantage of this and just tactically, brilliantly just march through the South and just destroy the Western theater, and then end up going up to Virginia and destroying Lee's army. But it's just and also Lee dies like right after the war. So like all this myth around Lee as such a great like god of a person is just a total myth. He's not. If you read these books, it really breaks it down to why he was not a good general.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many
He's a
points
way
that
better car than general. Way better car.
I mean, I don't know where there's so many points that you just mentioned that I want to elaborate on, but I'll start with Lee. We actually have testimonies from people that he enslaved talking about how brutal he was. And these were available at the time. These people were talking about just how awful of a person he was. We have also Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, wrote essays after essays critiquing and lambasting Lee. And in the same token, he talks about, he also blasts the myths of the lost cause as early in the 1900s. In one 1928 essay he wrote, I'm going to paraphrase it, but in terms of states' rights, he says, no one in history has ever gone to war based on some political motive in that regard. I'll have to find the exact quote, but nobody goes based on arbitrary, debates like that. And nobody goes to war on debates like that. But I want to bring up your point regarding the idea of losers right in the war, because I think what we have here is something really fascinating. There's rarely a time in history when the losers actually get a chance to write their own version of the war. Usually if you lose, you don't get to write your own narrative. I mean, there's some truth to the saying that history is written by the victors. And there are some notable exceptions. For instance, obviously there's a lot of literature about the Holocaust, despite Jewish people definitely not coming out as victors, but that's also because Nazis lost. So, and a lot of their main, organizers and top generals were killed. People who orchestrated the Holocaust and whatnot, they were executed, and rightly so. And so Germany underwent this idea of denazification, where they weren't allowed to put this Nazi ideology in schools, and they weren't allowed to perpetuate it, and it became in some ways outlawed. And now you have schools in Germany where they actually learn accurate history about World War II. They learn about Jewish history. They visit concentration camps and whatnot. But the South never underwent any kind of deconfederatization or whatnot. In fact, the exact opposite happened. They were allowed not just to control the textbooks, but they could run for office. They could write in newspapers, and they can build monuments and memorials. And that's because in the States, education is a state issue. So states got to do it. And I find that really fascinating, how this is a prime example of a losing side being able to write history. And those repercussions are they're deadly.
They really are, and it's crazy because Bonekemper, he says, like, the South perpetuates this myth, but the North accepts it. Like the North was like, whatever, and it goes along with it. And that did you want to bring up any more points of what do you want to, like, I don't know, maybe like being in Louisiana, you probably know more about what Longstreet did to put down that rebellion more than I do, but that's basically kind of the fact that he's just like, you know what? Yeah, he did with what the officers what they should have done, just be like, yeah, man, we lost. I'm a Republican now. I'm going to try to do good in this world. But it seems like it was just because he did that, they just totally just vilified him.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. And I believe it was in 1876. Louisiana was under a Republican government, which back then think of Republican as the party of Lincoln, and that was against slavery, or at least was founded to stop the spread of slavery. Very different today, obviously. I'm sure if anyone's listening to your podcast, they know that. But
we know.
Yeah, I always feel like it needs to definitely be said. But white Democrats lost an election, and they claimed that it was fraudulent, and they launched this essentially a coup in New Orleans to try to overtake the Republican government. And Longstreet was on the side of Republicans. And I believe, I'll have to fact check this, but I believe he was shot pretty early on because they were specifically targeting him for it. I don't know if he was shot. I'm pretty sure he was, but I know that he was a target because they thought of him as a traitor to the Confederacy, because he was leading the Metropolitan Police Force in New Orleans, which was mostly black. And so the idea of the police force in New Orleans being mostly black really upset a lot of white supremacists and the KKK and the White League. So they tried to overthrow the government, and they actually they succeeded for a few days. It was successful until the federal government and other people in Louisiana came in and overthrew them and took back the power. So it's a really interesting episode in history, and it also sounds familiar, right? You have someone claiming that was a fraudulent election.
I was just about to say, it's like angry white racists like get mad and they try to overthrow governments. It's like crazy. It's like, where have we heard this before? Just history repeats itself. I think one of the big things that I definitely really want to talk about with this is the notion of why the war was fought, and I'll break it into two categories. There's like the ultra lost causers, like people like my dad, who gave me this book about how the South was right, and I think it's like Winning the Course of Human Events. Like it's like just libertarian, just bullshit of a book. It actually was just the dean of history at the University of Alabama just ripped it to shreds, being like it's just revisionist crap. But they'll say it's like taxes and tariffs, and they'll make the excuse that Fort Sumter was attacked because it's where cotton tariffs were collected. My dad and other lost causes have said things like, "Oh, New Orleans was rivaling New York, so the federal government was mad about that, and the people in the North wanted to strangle the South because New Orleans it was cheaper to send stuff down the Mississippi River than to send it over to New York, and they couldn't have a southern port be more dominant than New York." That was a big one. So the ultra lost causes, I was always trying to paint it as like an economic thing with taxes and tariffs and whatnot. And then you have like the people who don't know they've fallen for lost cause mythology, who fall for lost cause mythology. And I'll set up the example like this. I see it a number of times on Facebook. Some lost cause will be like, the war was about states' rights and not slavery. And then someone will be like, well, what was that state's right to do? And Bonekemper really breaks this down in that you cannot say that the war was fought over states' rights, because before the Civil War, the South did not care at all about states' rights when Northern states refused to send
Fugitive Slave Act.
Yeah, the Fugitive Slave Act. They refused to send slaves back to the South. They refused to, as the South says, return our property. So they go to the federal government and it's like, you have to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, blah, 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 not even caring about the states' rights of the North. So that's like the big thing. Like this whole states' right argument doesn't hold water. But also, if you look at what these people wrote, if you look at the Articles of Secession, if you look at the cornerstone speech by the Vice President of the Confederacy, if you look about what all these people wrote, if you look about how the Deep South was trying to revamp the international slave trade, how they had people that were going to go to England and go to Portugal and go to other places and try to revamp the international slave trade. Like, if we'll win, we'll do that. And they only wrote in the Confederate Constitution to ban slave ships to appease the Rim South, to appease the northern South, the Rim, like Virginia and that area. But they had for all intent and purposes, like wanted to restart the international slave trade. And it was such a booming thing that they fought solely for slavery and solely for the institution of white supremacy. There's nothing in what they've written as like, we believe in states' rights. It's like, no, we believe that black people should be in bondage and fuck anyone else who says otherwise. And it's like it's written in black and white. And to say that the war was not over slavery from the Southern perspective, we can argue about what Lincoln's motives were. We can argue about like why he did what, why did this happen, why this. But the South's specific reason for secession and why they wanted to fight solely relied on keeping the institution of slavery and expanding the institution of slavery into the Caribbean, into Mexico, into Latin America, into the West where they wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They said that. That's, like you said, they were very open and honest about this. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the so-called Confederacy, and in fact, a lot of times the U.S. government never officially recognized the Confederacy. They would call it so-called Confederacy in a lot of their documents, and I found that absolutely hilarious. It was
the supposed Confederacy.
Right. It was like their version of like 19th century petty or something. But he said in his cornerstone speech that this is the cornerstone of the Confederacy is slavery. I mean, he laid it out crystal clear. And yeah, their Articles of Secession, mention it clearly. All of their little state Confederate constitutions say it was to. In Louisiana, it specifically says to preserve slavery. I mean, literal quote, to preserve slavery. So I always find it interesting when people who believe in lost cause ideology deny that, because what they're essentially doing is denying or ignoring or not listening to or disagreeing with the very people that they are trying to elevate in these conversations. So they're underwriting the actual Confederates who say one thing, and then you're like the lost cause adherents, they're going around and believing something entirely different. So yeah, it was clear. It was abundantly clear, and it couldn't have been any more clear that they wanted to preserve slavery and spread it, because Lincoln at the time of his inauguration didn't want to abolish slavery. He wanted to stop it from spreading, which would then cause the southern states to lose out in the Senate and the Congress in terms of representation, which would eventually wither that institution away. I mean, it would have been a long time down the line, but they saw the writing on the wall. And I think it's a great point that you bring up the Fugitive Slave Act, because that brought states' rights, or the idea of states' rights, was just the South, the Confederacy, the states that became the Confederacy didn't even adhere to it. They made it to where the northern states, if they came across somebody that could have been considered a runaway, an enslaved person who ran away, then they would have to bring that person back. You would be legally obligated to do so. So it didn't matter about states' rights. So not only did they not believe it before the war, they didn't talk about it during the war, and this didn't come about until, again, 1866 and afterwards. So yeah, if you ever want to look to debunk lost cause ideology, I tell people, look at what the Confederates themselves say. They made it very clear.
I think it also goes into, you could also see like where the secession votes, where they came from, and that the planter class that's heavily in the Black Belt, overwhelmingly where the power is, votes for secession. But you also have to note that in Appalachia, you have a vote against secession. And West Virginia, leaves Virginia over this later on during the war. But that also goes into, the notion that slavery was a thing, because the poor, where there's no farmland, they don't own slaves in Appalachia, right? So they're like, why are we seceding? This is stupid. And so it goes into, it's not about states' rights. It's solely about slavery. If it was about states' rights, and Appalachia would obviously vote in favor of secession, but they didn't. Overwhelmingly voted against secession. You have and later on, you see like in Jones County, Mississippi, you have people saying this is when it becomes perfectly clear, one, the South is going to lose, and two, that the war was solely about slavery. Jones County, Mississippi says, no, we're leaving. We're going to free state of Jones. You saw that movie, Matthew McConaughey. Even before, right after secession, Winston County in Alabama secedes from Alabama, and free state of Winston. East Tennessee and Appalachia. Mm-hmm. They sent, I think, 40,000 men to fight for the Union. Mm-hmm. And so you have this thing where, like, you can look at where the vote is and line that up with who has the most slaves. And then they're the ones that vote overwhelmingly for secession. And in the part of the country where there were none, they vote overwhelmingly to not secede. And so this whole notion that it is states' rights, to me, is just absolutely just wild.
And I think that's also part of lost cause ideology, because the people believe this. People who believe in lost cause, they'll talk about the South as if there was one unified force, that all the white people in the Confederacy joined together to fight against the Union. And it's just 100%, it's false. It's not true. In Louisiana, over 7,000 white people fought for the Union. And at the end of the war, towards the war end, there were over 100,000 white Southerners that fought for the Union rather than the South. And over 100,000 white Southerners deserted the Confederate Army. I mean, there's one act that I get my students to read in regards to the Confederacy. They passed this legislation, a conscription act, that said that you had to sign up between such as, I think, 18 and 35 or whatnot. You had to sign up. But if you could buy your way out, you didn't have to fight. And obviously, all the people who couldn't afford to buy their way out were like, well, what's going on? What's going on? And with that being said, it obviously should be emphasized that a lot of white Southerners did join the Confederacy and did want to uphold, white supremacy, and were racist and believed. Even, in fact, some people, again, lost cause ideology, they talk about well, the soldiers themselves didn't fight to uphold slavery. Well, number one, that's just not true. Some of them absolutely did, and we can read their letters and their documents. And two, it almost doesn't matter. They did fight. So the cause of the war exists regardless of whether someone decided to fight because they really felt the North was tyrannical or they really believed in some abstract government theory of states' rights and whatnot. So, I find that all fascinating. But the idea that the Confederacy was all unified, I would say that goes hand in hand with, because that's what I thought growing up. I didn't know that there were over 100,000. Even Sherman's March to the Sea, that was led by thousands of white Southerners. So it's a fascinating history that is very intricate and complicated. And lost cause myths just swallow it up whole and deliver this history as propaganda.
You brought up a good point with the so Bonekemper talks about how Southerners accept slavery as a social control, and that in the yeomanry and the overseers and the quote unquote poor whites don't see themselves as being exploited, but they see themselves as hey, one day if I work hard enough, I can become the planter class. So there is no Southern politics is weird, and I've taken it twice now, different levels, and the whole how class within the South changes and switches and alliances and things that you have the redemption, the populist movement, et cetera, whatnot. And even back then, it was you would think that the poor would align themselves more with the slaves because they saw more in common, but they didn't. They aligned themselves with the planter class because, as it goes, Americans think they only know oppressed millionaires. But they really did believe that at some time, if they worked hard enough, they could then become a planter class. It wasn't, and then they can own slaves. It wasn't that they looked up to these planters as hey, I can. So definitely those people, for sure, were probably made up of a lot of the core of why they fought for the Confederacy. But you did bring up the good point, and I would like people to understand that there were people, a number of Southerners who did not stand with the Confederacy and fought for the Union. But yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, large parts of Louisiana, the Cajun population, they didn't adhere to a lot of what the South or the Confederacy was bringing to the table. But you also bring up a lot of good points. You mentioned the idea that a lot of people, fought for. I'm trying to think of one point that you said that made me think about. Yeah, there were a lot of people that definitely did not sign up for the Confederacy, but this idea of this monolith, this Confederate monolith, really drives home for a lot of people. And I also think that causes harm too when people learn that history and then they believe this, and then that's just how history was. So yeah, there's so much to get into with that.
The one thing that I really, and this one irks me the most, and I wanted to see if you've read anything about this. I want to get other people, everyone else in the podcast's take on this. And the one myth that irks me the most is the myth of the Black Confederate, because it is absolute bullshit.
Okay, before we get to that, I just want to go back to what you talked about with the yeoman farmers. I had the thought in my head and I couldn't get it back, but I remember now. So some yeoman farmers, a large percentage of them, I can't remember the exact numbers, they would rent out enslaved people to work seasons and whatnot. So they might have never owned them, the entire time, but there were a lot of poor white Southerners, yeoman farmers that did do that. And a large part of Lee's army and the Confederate armies were yeoman farmers who did engage in that. And even if they didn't do that or they weren't part of the planter class, they still felt them to be themselves in a system where they did benefit from slavery, just like how a lot of white people in the past and today have benefited from that institution, regardless of whether, their families participated in it. So I definitely wanted to elaborate on that there were a lot of them that might have never had it, 20 or whatever, owned 20 people and whatnot, but they did rent out and from actual planters and whatnot. And like you said, that was their goal. That was what they were aspiring to. But the myth of the Black Confederate is absolutely fascinating. I've had conversations with people in person when I've gone to these protests against well, I don't know if you're familiar, but in New Orleans, they've taken down most of the Confederate statues and memorials in 2017. There was an organization taking down NOLA that did a lot of that work. And we would march and we would go and protest. People would show up and they would say things like that. That was one of the first myths they would bring up is, Black Confederates. And in fact, it was the Union that, a large part of the Union Army was Black Southerners who escaped and fought for the Union. So much so that it was considered a rallying cry for the South. They thought of it as like, look, these enslaved people are fighting against us and went and got their freedom, and there's an insurrection and we got to put it down. And there's all these episodes of the Confederacy literally full out executing Black Union soldiers who surrendered. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the guy who later founded the KKK, was he led one of those awful
the Fort Pillow massacre. Yeah, the Fort
exactly
Pillow massacre. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and if white Union soldiers were surrendering, they would accept it, and then Black Union soldiers they wouldn't accept those that surrender, and that happened quite frequently. So the idea, and I know you definitely talked about this before the podcast, so I'll let you take it, but it is just an absurd notion.
So basically, the myth of the Black Confederate comes from photographs that were distorted to push this myth, and also for the South to be like, oh, look, slaves like joined us and they fought because we were fighting for bravery and honor. We weren't fighting for slavery. But the Bonekemper goes into there's no credible evidence at all to say that Black people fought for the Confederacy. That any slave ran away to fight for the Confederacy or willingly signed up to fight for the Confederacy. What you have is Confederate officers who were plantation owners or their sons who were officers, and they would send personal servants, slaves, to be with the officers, and they would give them uniforms, but they were cooks. They, polished silverware. They made sure that their rifles were working. They did stuff that, like, in the rear. They were cooks. They carried dead bodies. They were the personal servants to these officers that were slave owners. They never once took up arms and to fight Union soldiers. And one thing that Bonekemper brings up specifically is the case of Major General Patrick Claiborne. Claiborne was an Irish immigrant, and he was a Confederate general. And Claiborne saw after the battles of Chattanooga and Chickamauga, where the Confederacy horrible numbers were lost at those battles. I think Chickamauga, they say that the bodies were stacked like 6 high for over a mile. Like, it was horrible. And Claiborne was a brilliant tactician, and Bonekemper argues that his tactics in the rear guard saved the Confederate Army of Tennessee, and let them escape into Georgia. But Claiborne saw the writing on the wall, and that we don't have the manpower to keep dragging this out if we're going to be this aggressive. So what he said, him and 13 of his subordinate officers actually go to Davis and Lee and the officer corps, and he writes out and presents this extremely elaborate, well thought out proposal to allow enslaved people to fight for the Confederacy, to give them arms, to train them, to form obviously white people. Like, so in the Union, they would have white officers, obviously, but they would fight for the Confederacy, and that they would be granted their freedom afterwards and allowed to be, first-class citizens and be granted freedom and land, et cetera, after the war. And he writes this elaborate proposal. Bonekemper goes into it in great detail, and it's fairly convincing. It's a very well thought out proposal. It is shot down hard. Davis and Lee and all of them are like, what the hell are you talking about? They are like, this goes against everything we stand for. Right. Why would you ever, you Patty, want to arm these slaves? This goes against everything. Because they're like, you want to give them guns? They're going to turn their guns on us. And the real, one quick thing, the real just icing on this cake is that Claiborne ignorantly thought that this was going to work and that this was going to be a thing. And he was like, oh, this is a plan we can win. Because he did this, he was passed over a promotion. They blackballed him, and they said, we are not going to promote. arguably best general, past major general, into brigadier or whatever comes up next. They weren't going to make him a higher ranking general because he proposed arming slaves and having them fight for the Confederacy and then become freed afterwards. And but yeah, Chris, did you want to go? Because I have a little bit more, but if you want to touch in on this, it's wild.
No, the only thing I want to say is I've read that the Confederacy, one of the reasons why they felt that slavery needed to be upheld is because of what happened in Haiti.
Yeah.
The idea that the enslaved revolted and murdered all the white people on the island, except for the Polish immigrants. And that's a really interesting story. And so the idea of giving Black people weapons in the South to fight for the Confederacy would completely shatter that myth. And because it's essentially they're driving fear in the hearts of white people to fight for the Confederacy, saying, look, if we don't uphold slavery, what happened in Haiti is going to happen here in the American South. Obviously, it didn't happen, and there's no evidence that it was going to happen, but they would have shattered that myth. But yes, definitely keep going. I'm enjoying it.
No, yeah, but so Claiborne just sacrifices his career as a Confederate officer because he puts forth this proposal. Like I said, it's completely shot down, and they just ostracize him completely. They're like, "Why did you ever do this?" They laughed about it. And the what does it have? So the only time, I think I have it written. Oh yeah. So okay. So the CSA rejected the use of Black soldiers until the last months of Lee's army's existence, and out of millions of slaves that were in the United States, I think they only were able to muster 90 that were allowed by their masters to take up arms. And it, like I said, only a few months before Lee's army was decimated and surrenders at Appomattox. And basically what I found in some research is that what they'll do is they'll take black and white photos of Black Union troops. They'll crop out their white officers and make it look like, oh, look, their suits are gray. They're Black Confederate soldiers, but people have found the originals and they're like, hold on, this is actually like a Union company, and this their white that's a Union officer so and so who led them. And so the notion that they fought willingly for the Confederacy fought at all, willingly and unwillingly, is just absolutely ridiculous. The Bonekemper talks about how Jefferson Davis was shocked that his slaves abandoned him when Grant's army is marching through Virginia. And they're just like, why did my slave leave? And it was like, his house slave just like, fuck you, dude, and just left. They're like, please, Grant, take us, save us.
Yeah, that reminds me of a story. Harriet Tubman actually led some forces into a raid in either South Carolina, I believe, and these Black troops were approaching the plantations and freeing people along the way. And one of the slave owners, the enslavers, they were saying, "Oh my God, we got to run! We have to go!" And all of the people that he enslaved were like, "Are you kidding me? What? We're not running. We're staying right here." And he's like, "Off to the woods we go!" And they were like, "Absolutely not." So one of they give a testimony, and it's just hilarious how clueless this person was, that he just assumed these people would just follow him, willingly. To leave the Union troops that were actually freeing the enslaved. So, I mean, there was just a lot of delusion there. And that's because the system was so intense that people couldn't be honest with, the planter class. It was, if you said anything negative in any way, obviously, it wasn't going to be anything nice. I don't know how else to say it.
You brought up a really interesting point there. And I want to say, the lost cause mythology is not just promoting a myth, but it's also obviously it's suppressing the truth, but it's also suppressing things like, I did not know that Harriet Tubman actually led troops in the battle. I found that out, a Drunk History episode. That's the only time I never in school, never high school, undergrad, grad, nothing. I did not know that Harriet Tubman did that.
She was a badass soldier. She did a lot. Yeah.
I had no idea it was a Drunk History episode. I found that out on.
Yeah, I mean, oh, go ahead.
Have you seen the videos that people go to sharing around about the older Black gentleman who dresses in the Confederate fucking And he goes to
Are you
all
talking
these-
about the bullshit episode about reparations? Because I was looking that up. I know that a couple of us here used to watch Penn and Teller's Bullshit, and there was an episode in 2006 about reparations, and there was a guy, a black man, who would dress in a Confederate uniform and walk to like a monument somewhere. And for Penn and Teller are libertarians, so they're like, "Oh, who cares about reparations bullshit?" But yeah, like that was my first time actually hearing about like the Black Confederate idea. I don't know if I just was like brought up in like a liberal bastion in Orlando, but like that was the first time I ever heard it.
This could be the same guy. I just know this guy.
It's the same guy. It's the same.
Yeah, my dad sharing the fucking videos of this guy is like saying, "Oh, look, it wasn't about slavery. It's about fucking states' rights."
So what that evidence that guy has been able to put forth is exactly the photographs that I've talked about. Two style of photographs. One, the altered ones, but two, yes, you did see Black people in Confederate uniforms. What they don't tell you is that they were uniforms given to cooks, and they were uniforms given to servants that followed around their white masters, and they were forced to serve them on the battlefield and before in the camps and whatnot. And they had uniforms, but they were not soldiers. They were auxiliary. Like I said, they were slaves. They were essentially slaves, individual slaves for officers, who either were slave owners or they were the sons of slave plantation owners and slave masters. And so because this myth is allowed to perpetuate, right, unfortunately, he believes in this myth that, yes, his Black ancestors fought for the Confederacy and it was for this. And it's sad because it's not, because like, as Chris said, there are hundreds of thousands of Black people who fought for the Union, who fought and died to liberate the South and to end slavery. And it's just sad that people.
Didn't anybody watch Glory? I mean, I had to when I
Glory.
was in high school.
Yeah. That's a great, and it also goes into the fact that like how the South treated Black Union soldiers. They just dumped them in a mass grave. They did not they didn't give a shit. They were just racist assholes, and they just dumped them into mass graves. And they dumped Matthew Broderick character. I forgot what his Colonel so and so, but they threw him in a mass grave too, along with his troops. And funny enough, his parents said, leave him there. He wanted to be buried with his troops. It's an honorable thing. But the Confederacy saw it as a disgrace. They saw it as this white man being buried with slaves, essentially. And so, but yeah, they didn't give two fucks about. They racist assholes, the Confederacy.
Yeah, and I think. Go ahead.
Just coming from a place where you're part of one of those marginalized classes as an Indigenous person, or I would assume for Black people as well, is that whenever the ruling class, whoever is making the optics, can target somebody who's perpetuating what they think, they're going to become the only one that they ever talk about, which is why all of us know this one man who would dress up in this Confederate uniform. I think he was in South Carolina. He's one of the Carolinas, maybe. But we're all like, a lot of people like us are used to this, that if you can find a Candace Owen, if you can find this guy in this uniform, if you can find there's this video going around about this apparently Indigenous woman talking about how bad socialism is by looking at reservations out west. Like, as long as you can find one, that's the one that's going to be shared around.
Right, because they believe it gives them some sort of legitimacy. Look, somebody that agrees with me. And now y'all, I mean, this is a fascinating point that y'all mentioned, especially when you said you didn't know about Harriet Tubman. I didn't know that either. And I have a history degree, and I feel like I'm fairly educated with history. And it was something that I learned, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, that she led this battle. And that also got me thinking about lost cause ideology. Not only is it, absolutely it's wrong and it's a myth, but it also minimizes and waters down. I wouldn't even say minimizes or waters down Black history, but it completely ignores Black history and just leaves it out. So a lot of white Southerners aren't getting that version of history, but they're being told that slavery was a benevolent institution. Essentially what the lost cause has done, which is why I think it's so dangerous, is they've taken the most brutal institution in our nation's history and then made it almost irrelevant to the schooling of white kids, or essentially what happened in with Black troops in the Union. These kind of histories aren't told to people throughout the country. So essentially the lost cause is not just promoting racist ideology, but it's suffocating actual history, specifically Black history in our country.
So I got the name of the guy who dressed in the Confederate costume. It's Thomas Sowell.
Shut up. But I had to read his book in undergrad. It was the Black Rednecks and White Liberals. It's like, oh my god. But yeah, great. Yeah, it's basically it's just, it goes back to just people being able to manipulate images, and it's just like they're like, oh look, this picture shows this person, but he wasn't a soldier, and it's like it goes into this myth that like they were Black Confederates, but they weren't, and it's something that's continuously perpetuated, really, in the hardcore lost cause people.
I mean, you look at how strong the iconography is for them, that you have monuments as big as Stone Mountain, which we've gone over before. That's very, like with the Daughters of the Confederacy, like I talked about on Stone Mountain, they're the reason for that. And you have the monuments all over, not even just the South, all over the United States. And you have the imagery of the battle flag, even though that didn't come out until like mid 19th century. Like you have a very, very strong iconography, in which case you don't have to explain the entire history. You can point and say, look at how important it is. We have it everywhere. Look at how big it is on the side of this mountain, you know? And so you don't have to worry about the nuance. You don't have to worry about explaining any of that. It's very easy, quick idea.
I think no, go ahead. Does anyone because I have like one little more thing I could go over that is talking about a myth, but if anyone wants to chime in more about the myth of the Black Confederate.
Oh no, go ahead.
So one thing that is really touched on is Grant himself and the tactics that were used in the South, and he's really one of the, not to get too much into it because I didn't have a lot of information on that, but there's this myth about Grant that he was just like a drunk butcher, and that he just won overwhelmingly by throwing waves and waves of people at it. And there's one particular battle that people bring up, Cold Harbor, and where Grant should have, he even said after it, I should have done something different. But the tactics that he uses in Mississippi and then in Tennessee and going into Georgia are studied by generals and military tacticians and historians in other countries. And they're like, what he did was what we would have done. And so this idea that Grant was just like this buffoon, drunken butcher is just ridiculous. He was actually a very tactical, well thought out general in modern tactics. And one of the things Bonekemper brings up is that he is the first general you see really with a cabinet around him, he's like the first modern general, and that he has so many people under him to his general staff is what I should say. So the first modern general staff, right? Lee had like 3 or 4 people in his staff. Grant has this elaborate general staff that is able to run things efficiently and do things that he wants and et cetera, whatnot. So this idea that Grant and specifically Sherman just go in and just butcher people like through the South, and that somehow, you know, they always say like, you know, Sherman burning Atlanta was like the worst thing that ever happened. But really it was Lee who is this not good general, because one thing that Bonekemper brings up specifically is that Lee lost overall and per capita more people than Grant. Like Lee squandered his resources by throwing men into battle that he shouldn't have, and he wanted this grandiose like Battle of Waterloo final thing, this aggressive, overly aggressive attack that didn't happen, that didn't need to happen. He just needed to play a defensive war and grind the Union down and get Lincoln to lose in 64 and have McClellan win, and then sue for peace. So this idea that Grant is some sort of bumbling idiot is just completely wrong.
I mean, yeah, that's exactly what I was taught growing up, was that the Union didn't have good generals. They just had numerical advantage and industrial might, and the South had the savants as their generals, the Stonewall Jackson, who actually advocated for a type of total war. That he was a proponent of it.
Yeah,
Lee and Beauregard and these figures that were just fighting against all odds. So yeah, I think that's another myth, because that speaks nothing to like the morals of the war, right? It's just, oh, the South fought this heroic cause, and obviously they were at such a disadvantage. There was no way they were gonna win, despite the superiority of the generals and the officers. So yeah, it's a fascinating take on how it's taught, and a lot of that is through textbooks that were supported by the United Daughters of the Confederacy and Confederate generals, and all these textbook committees that only allow those type of lost cause myths to be in actual classrooms. So generations of white Southerners were taught these things.
And then we also need to look at movies, because I've seen on YouTube where like Gods and Generals is just like
all right.
If you want to talk about how Gods and Generals is massive lost cause bullshit, please.
I mean, that even before Gods and Generals, in 1915, Birth of a Nation came out, and I'm sure you're familiar with this movie, but if you haven't, if your listeners are interested, just YouTube it, and you can actually watch clips that show Black men as rapists and the KKK as the saviors of these white women, or of white women jumping off cliffs to avoid being raped and whatnot. And it's awful. It actually led to the resurgence of the KKK in the late 19-teens and 1920s. And it was a film that was one of the most popular films at the time. Woodrow Wilson unveiled it in the White House, and that supported lost cause ideology. And then in 1939, Gone with the Wind came out, which also supported lost cause ideology by making Reconstruction look like it was the fault of the North for trying to exploit the South, and it perpetuated these myths about slavery. And the book actually upholds the KKK again in a positive light. And you see this all throughout. Even Disney has a film that perpetuates lost cause myths. I can't remember the name of it.
Song of the South.
Yeah.
Song of the South.
That's where Zippity Doo-Dah comes from, actually.
And
it's one of the only films that Disney will never release again.
I mean, that's makes sense. But yeah, even as late, like you said, as 2003, Gods and Generals paints the Confederate cause in a sympathetic light. This is not ancient history. It's not a century ago. And I've watched clips of this. There's a scene where Stonewall Jackson gives this vigorous speech on horseback, where he's blaming the North for starting the war. And towards the end, there's another scene. Again, he's on horseback, and he's giving a farewell speech to his army. And he's calling the Confederate cause the, quote, Second War of Independence. And you could hear violin music playing in the background. And this grossed millions of dollars, and people were watching it. And so I think when we focus on the monuments and the textbooks, and and how it was perpetuated and spread through those means, but film, I would say, arguably, because that was from Hollywood. That was the North was culpable in this. This was a united effort in the country, it seems, to perpetuate these myths through film. But yeah, I remember Gods in General when it came out, and revisiting those and watching those clips. It's just I'm just flabbergasted how I guess I shouldn't be, to be honest, but yeah, it's just it was awful.
Fucking lost cause softcore for boomers.
That's exactly what it was.
My dad says it was the second American Revolution, and he says that exact line, that it's like it was the second American Revolution, blah blah blah. I'm just like, oh my God, no, please stop.
I mean, in the movie, Stonewall Jackson, in one speech that I was referencing, he says it like 3 times. It's just, people are just bombarded with that ideology, and there's no disclaimer beforehand, or there's no, so if you don't know anything about history and you pop on a movie about the Civil War because you want to learn, or you find it interesting, because a lot of people are interested in the military aspect of the war.
Yeah.
And they see that, they're going to leave thinking, all right, so the South thought it was the second war of, as opposed to no, the South was trying to perpetuate and preserve slavery.
I think he even brings up in Gods and Generals that he brings up the notion of total war. He's talking about I think he's talking to some colonel that defected from the Union and wants to fight for the Confederacy as a Virginian. And he brings up this notion of like, we need to raise the black flag and fight a total war. It'll bring the Yankees to their knees. And it's just like, you paint Grant and Sherman during the Civil War as these total war people, but really it was Stonewall Jackson that wanted to rate this total war type deal, and it's just
disclaimer though. Grant and Sherman did turn out to be complete fucking monsters.
Oh no,
but
obviously, yeah. You took. I was gonna reference that at the end that like that Sherman and Grant and all them end up turning, and Sheridan specifically go on after the Civil War to massacre indigenous people in the plains. It's just like it's one of those things where like don't build up these cult of personalities around these people. And we say that like the only
Is this because I made fun of you guys and all of your Sherman memes?
Yes.
Good.
I was gonna say it because your voice was gone, but I'm glad that your ASMR voice is good. But the official take is that the only Confederate statue that should be allowed to be erected is of the cockeyed cousin fucker that shot Stonewall Jackson. and the bottom it should say his words of it's some sort of damn Yankee trick. Because his soldiers hated him. Like his soldiers hated Stonewall Jackson. And there's actually like going around that like they probably knew it was him and they shot because they really fucking hated Stonewall Jackson. But yeah.
I believe
the only Stonewall Jackson worth of shit is the 1960s country singer who would tour around with George Jones. That's the only Stonewall Jackson that worth of shit.
The only good generally is the car. Oh man. But y'all, do we have any questions, any thoughts, anything that we want to talk about? Anything else to come to the lost cause, or do we learn anything, or
any good Civil War movies?
Glory, right? Glory.
Yeah, I would say Glory. Is the movie specifically about Gettysburg? I think that's even lost cause bullshit because it plays into the notion that Lee was great and it was Longstreet's fault and all this other bullshit. I remember being in a battlefield history class and the professor like blaming Longstreet, where it's like it really wasn't Longstreet's fault.
What about Cold Mountain? Where you guys sitting on that?
I like Cold Mountain.
I've never seen it.
I think Cold Mountain actually plays into, but Cold Mountain actually shows like how horrible the Home Guard was, and how like people who didn't want to fight for the Confederacy were like rounded up and shot by the Home Guard, and how like people wanted to leave and like defect from the CSA.
I think the whole A&E Hackfield McCoy shows a good like post Civil War Virginia and West Virginia.
Other like there was like a string of Civil War movies for a while. Like they were just like back to back to back to back, and then they kind of stopped. But I haven't seen Glory. I need to see Glory.
They stopped because Captain America died. So
yeah, that's a really good Civil War. Captain America Civil War, very good. Very little racism.
Is that a thing? I've never seen it. I've never heard of it.
Oh, it's good. Lee wins.
Yeah.
Shut up.
Captain America can't be racist because he has Falcon with him.
Oh, yeah.
and he's black, so
Falcon was a black.
Tony
Falcon's
Stark
a
owns
black.
slaves in the movie. Tony Stark doesn't want to give up his slaves.
Falcon's a black Confederate.
Oh man.
But yeah, this has definitely been something I've wanted to do for a while. But I'm glad we were able to do it.
Yeah, I learned a lot. Heritage, not hate.
And Tommy definitely fought for the Confederacy.
How we made it this far in the episode and not mention Leonard Skinner?
Well, you just did, so there you go.
Yeah.
Didn't he change his the flag or whatever? And then he doesn't use the battle flag anymore.
Oh yeah. He finally they switched it to the American flag.
Oh, did he? I thought he switched it to like St. Andrew's Cross or something like that. Can't remember.
I don't know, but if you guys ever want to know like the ninth circle of hell, it's going to a free Leonard Skinner concert at Universal in Orlando during Orlando's Mardi Gras celebrations.
Oh my God.
Y'all have Mardi Gras out there?
At Universal, yeah.
Oh yeah. No, actually, what was it? Is it Mobile is the first Mardi Gras, don't forget.
That's not true. That's a lost cause myth. No, but it was Louisiana though. We got to take that one. It was first celebrated here in 1699. So
All we get is Shrove Tuesday here, and everybody else gets cool stuff.
There's one thing about Louisiana my dad actually brings up, and he's printed off stuff, and it's like boomer print offs, like the edges are cut off. So I didn't know like what it was, and I can't find anything about it anywhere. And Chris, I want to see if maybe you had heard of him. Going back to the Black Confederate, one of the things that they perpetuate is this thing, the Pelican rifles, and apparently they were a company in Louisiana that were all Black Confederates, but you can't find anything about it anywhere except from like obscure lost cause websites. And I'm pretty sure they probably just found like a Union company and said that they were Confederates, but like I can't find anything about it. So I was wondering, maybe as a history teacher in Louisiana, have you ever heard of anything, the Pelican rifles?
I've been doing research on Civil War Reconstruction. Been teaching for 11 years now. I had never heard of such a thing. I don't know. I had never heard of it. I would put my savings on it, which isn't a lot, but I would put that on it that it didn't exist. In fact, no, I would say absolutely it's a myth. The Pelican rifles, that just sounds like
Pelican
something
rifles. Yeah.
I can't believe you're asking an actual history teacher about bullshit your dad spouted.
I want to be able to be like, Dad, this is bullshit, but he's not going to believe me anyway, so it doesn't matter. He's too far gone.
Right.
You can't prove a negative.
Yeah, and exactly. And we should have mentioned early in the episode, we're talking about a conspiracy theory. The evidence isn't going to change the minds of a lot of these people. It's a literal conspiracy. I mean, I did a TikTok where I mentioned all of the Confederates and what they said and why they seceded. And then people were still in the comments, that's not true. And I was like, that it's literally the Confederates. So it would take a lot for someone to change their mind on that.
Yeah. I'm gonna before I do the outro, Chris, thank you for coming on. Where can people find you at?
Yes. So I have Twitter at Chris Dier, Dier is how you spell my last name. I'm on TikTok at CMDLA. I have a website, chrisdier.com, where I write some blogs and whatnot. So I'll probably be posting some soon. I think this was a fascinating conversation. I want to write my brain was just flowing. I feel like I want to write something about the lost cause now. Yeah, you can find me on any of those mediums and email me chrisdier3@gmail.com if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments or concerns. But yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I think one last point, if I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is that I think we can tie it a little bit back to today. The implications of people, millions of white people believe in lost cause myths. They tend to vote a certain way and believe in certain policies. And I think that's the harm of it. Some people are like, why do you spend so much time trying to debunk these myths? And I think it's important that we realize that it creates real material harm. It's not something that just exists in the past, but these people believe this. They're voting for Trump. They're voting, for people that are they're voting for a racist system. So,
ironically, they're voting for Republicans.
Exactly.
Their ancestors knew they would like turn over in their graves. But
thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
No problem, Chris. No problem. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. And we got one thing that mentioned after the outro real quick, so stay on. At Dixieland, the proletariat will believe the South will rise again, but this time for the right reasons and not the lost cause, but those being worker-owned means of production, decolonization, and self-determination for all oppressed peoples. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to us on social media at Dixie Prole. We are coming to you from the birthplace of the civil rights movement, Montgomery, Alabama, as well as the United Kingdom. We'd also like to recognize that we're recording on land that is occupied and rightfully belongs to the Muskogee Nation. Tommy does a lot of our streaming on Twitch. You can find us at twitch.tv/DOTProl. That's .prol. But Tommy, do you want to talk about what we're as the podcast, what we're doing with that real quick in our GoFundMe? You're muted.
Sorry. Raising money to get better equipment so we can stream more and better and, more content.
Hell yeah.
So donate to our GoFundMe.
Tommy's done a lot of work at looking at what kind of equipment we need for a new rig so that we can so that he can actually like get stuff running through it.
Yes.
Rather than things breaking down every 5 minutes when we've tried to before.
Because the computer we're working with now is ancient.
Yeah, I tell you, every hour, like every time I set up a Twitch stream, it takes me like 2 hours of like prep work to reset everything because my computer is off.
You don't know how many viruses we've gotten from Tommy uploading episodes to LimeWire.
Yeah.
But yeah, check us out, y'all, on I believe, Tommy, correct me if I'm wrong, Saturdays at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. So that's 8 Eastern. Whatever time that is in the United Kingdom, I'll leave that up to Kai. But
who gives a fuck? And also, who gives a fuck about the West Coast as well? Apparently,
that'd be 5 o'clock West Coast, 6 Mountain Time, 7 Central, and 8 Eastern. So there we go. Whoever wants to live in Mountain Time. But yeah, so Saturdays at 7 Central. Basically, watch. We're gonna stream stuff. Tommy gets on sometimes if you want to watch and play Gears of War, some other or other video games. But yeah. So that's that. And Tommy's also going to leave the podcast and become a YouTube content creator when it comes to computer stuff.
the point of this was that we have a GoFundMe going currently. Probably if you're listening to this as it comes out, it will still be going. We're still trying to raise money to try to upgrade our equipment. So if you go to, I assume our Twitter, I don't do that one, our Twitter, our Instagram, our Facebook, our fan groups. If you're in our Discord, hopefully you've already seen it because you're part of the close crew. But yeah, if you've not seen the link, go find it. We could really appreciate the help. Thanks.
Really appreciate y'all. I will drop the link in the show notes. I'll get Chris to send me links to find his stuff. And please donate, because that's a platform we definitely want to tap into, and it seems to be something that people like. So we want to give our fans content they want to see. So without further ado, Tyler, you want to send us off?
All right. Well, good Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. We'll see y'all next time.
Here we go.
All right.
I just saw you messaged me, and yeah, my mic was on the wrong thing. I really hope that it comes through in my headphones, but I really hope it came through. I would be horrible if this is the episode.
Sorry, everybody.
If this is the episode where it's like, oh, God damn it. Like the one where like Tommy.
I could hear every squeak of your chair.
Yeah. Your reverb was so bad.
Oh my God.
But I'm glad you mentioned it to ruin the episodes. Now I have to cut all of this out. So don't mention it anymore, and we can just move on. So thank you, Nelson.
I hate you all.
I messaged you like 5 minutes in.
My binder was covered my phone.
Your binder full of women?
Yeah.
Okay.